Hello, my darlings. You're back once again with me, Ed Stott on That's Helpful, and I'm thrilled to have you here. If you're enjoying these weekly servings of self-improvement backed by science, can I ask you a favour? Would you mind leaving me a review wherever you're listening? I would be so grateful. I adore reading them, and it helps other people find our little club too. Now today, something I'd say most of us are battling with. If you've ever shared that you're feeling it, the most common reaction is, oh my gosh, me too. I'm talking about imposter syndrome. It's brutal, unhelpful, and feels horrible. So why do we experience it, and how can we tackle it? Well, that's exactly what we're going to take down today. By the way, this episode was requested by Jess on Instagram. If there's something you're struggling with, follow me at That's Helpful Pod and send me a DM, because if you're going through it, it's likely that so many of us out here are too, and I can get you an answer. My guest today is the wonderful Dr Jessamy Hibberd. She's a clinical psychologist and the author of The Imposter Cure: How to Stop Feeling Like a Fraud and Escape the Mind Trap of Imposter Syndrome. Jessamy, let's start at the top. What is imposter syndrome actually?
Well, it feels like something quite recent, but it was actually first defined back in 1978 by two clinical psychologists. Yeah, Dr. Clance and Dr. Emmis, and they discovered it. They were university lecturers, and they noticed that women in their kind of lectures were often less kind of able to come forward or put themselves up for things, and often kind of felt insecure about how they were doing. And they researched it, and they defined it as a phenomenon in which people believe they don't deserve their success, despite evidence to the contrary, and that they've got a lack of belief in their ability or competence, even though everybody else is seeing something different. And when I looked at it, and, you know, it's something that comes up a lot in my clinic, I started to see it as a faulty belief. So anytime you're doing something difficult or that pushes you out of your comfort zone, it's really natural to experience some fear. The trouble is, when you're thinking you've got imposter syndrome or that you are an imposter, you interpret that as meaning you're not up to the task or that you're not good enough, instead of recognizing that actually even confident people feel this. This is like a really normal human experience.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? Because I know anytime I've ever spoken about it, everybody does genuinely go, yeah, me too. How is it different to just like a general lack of self-doubt? You kind of touched on it there, you know, with people just having a general fear about trying new things. But how is imposter syndrome different to that?
The big difference is that it doesn't go away. So for most people, you know, say you're doing a presentation, you're nervous about it, you go and do the presentation, and then afterwards you're like, oh, that was horrible, but actually I did it and I can see I can do that, and you feel better. Whereas when imposters do things, they've got two rules at play. So if they're doing something and they get negative feedback, they take that on as a personal failing. And anything that, whether it's something somebody said or whether it's just how they think they did, they kind of take that as evidence that they're not doing well enough, even if the outcome's good. Whereas when it goes well, they put it down to the team, or it was lucky, or, you know, they're just being really nice. And so they have an inability to take on board how they're doing. And it means that even though you're doing all this great stuff, you're probably getting good feedback. You know, the funny thing about imposter syndrome is it's much more likely to affect high achieving, highly competent people. But in spite of that, because of the high standards you set yourself and because of the way you attend to information, you never take on board your success. And so it's kind of like you've never done those things, and you're left feeling exactly the same. And the other thing that can be problematic is people think, you know, surely you're going to get a promotion, then it is better. But actually that can make you feel like, oh, now I've got even further to fall. You know, there's more eyes on me, there's more pressure. And so it can actually ramp it up, instead of meaning that, you know, like with confidence, a promotion might make you realize that you're good enough or doing well. With imposter syndrome, it's almost the opposite.
Oh, it's brutal, isn't it? It's absolutely brutal. And so many of us have experienced it. And when you hear it described in that way, you know, like no matter the accolade, no matter the success, you're still going to feel this way. It's really obvious that this is absolutely a problem that we need to solve. It feels like it's something that everybody's experiencing, but how many people do genuinely suffer with imposter syndrome?
Yeah, the research suggests it's about 70% of people. And
wow.
that was kind of, over the course of your life, 70% of people will experience it. A study in 2019, I think it was, looked at the difference between men and women, and they found that in a year, you were likely to have imposter thoughts for just over 2/3 of women and just over 50% of men. So that wouldn't mean that you necessarily had imposter syndrome, but it meant that actually you'd have those thoughts. And for some people, it was really pervasive and had a really big effect on their life. And those researchers also found that for the people where it was affecting them day to day, it didn't just affect them at work. They were really kind of worn down by it emotionally. It had an impact on home or family life. And so it's not just this thing that can affect you, in one place in your life, it kind of overspills into other areas as well.
Yeah, because we do tend to think of it as something that we only suffer from in like a career setting or in our jobs. But it is something that we can absolutely feel in other areas of our life too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it doesn't really discriminate, imposter syndrome. So although Clancy and Nimitz thought it was women originally, we now know it can affect men and women across different cultures. It affects you depending on your sense of belonging to a group. So whether your socioeconomic status or sexuality or whatever it might be. And so whether you're a new starter or the CEO, you can get it. And like you say, it's not just at work that people experience it, though that's what's most commonly researched. People talk to me about it affecting them in their relationships or their confidence as a parent. So it can really kind of prey on all areas of life.
Oh, it makes you sad to think about all these beautiful people going about thinking that they don't belong when actually they're probably doing really great things.
Yeah, definitely.
And so can you actually have it and not know you have it as well?
That's what's really interesting. Actually, on the whole, people don't think they've got it. They think they really are an imposter and that they're not doing well enough. And that's one of the most difficult things about it. And I remember getting this lovely email from someone who'd read my book and they said, I read your book, but I didn't really think I was an imposter. Didn't really think I had imposter syndrome. I thought I really was an imposter. And it wasn't until I read the book that it made a difference. And so for lots of people, it's just how they've gone about their lives and they haven't had a name to put to it. And instead, they've been kind of living in fear or kind of constantly having this sense that they might be found out. But they've believed that's because they're not doing well. And like you said at the start, when you talk to people about it, they're like, oh, yeah. When I first got the book deal, people would say, I think I've got that. Is it normal? And that's the thing. People don't tend to talk about it. So then it's kind of laced with shame and secrecy. And then we don't have a chance to be more open and hear, oh, I feel exactly the same, and start to realize how common this experience is.
Yeah, absolutely. It is super common. And so tell me about the link between imposter syndrome and perfectionism, because this is quite pervasive, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And what the research shows is that, if you experience imposter syndrome, there's a strong correlation with perfectionism as well. And in a way, it's the same kind of thing, although they're quite different. It's this that you set yourself these incredibly high standards and that you kind of strive to reach them. And you rarely feel like you do because your standard is set so high, far above what anybody else is expecting of you. And so when it comes to perfectionism, it's likely that you've probably got imposter syndrome too, and it becomes a coping strategy to manage those fears. So when you don't feel good enough or you feel like a fraud, you think, I'm just going to work harder. And often in these high achieving kind of areas, whether it's university or work, you don't have a full sense of how other people are doing. So you think, well, I've just got to do better than them. And so you ramp up your expectation higher because in your head, you think they're doing really well. I don't know what they're up to. And that's the trouble. It starts to narrow your life. And in a way, the trouble with perfectionism is it doesn't all feel bad. We think, why is anybody doing this? But actually, there's this payoff sometimes of achieving more and that you kind of persuade yourself, well, I'm working these really long hours. Maybe my friends aren't, but they're not doing as well, or they're not getting paid as much, or it's just until I get this promotion. And so slowly it starts to narrow your life. And the other thing is that it has this big impact on your health and happiness, because when you do well, you're not feeling like you do because there's no such thing as perfect. And so every time you're feeling like you're falling short, And so there isn't that same satisfaction that you would get just from, having a reasonable expectation of meeting that. And it starts to, disrupt things so that you can't go and enjoy things or have your downtime because you feel like, oh, I should be doing more. And so it starts to take over. And what I also notice is it can overspill. So it can start with some people in work, then suddenly they're trying to perfect their home life as well, or their sporting life, or whatever it might be. And I think it's so easy to miss the detrimental impact it has. And it's really difficult to give up. So when I say to people, come on, you've got to try and do a bit less, like pull back so you've got more time for other things. They look at me like I'm mad. But actually, when they start to do that and build in a bit more time for hobbies or friends or, just watching TV in the evening, they find then they're more productive at work, and they're actually starting to let go of those standards gives them room to do better.
Yeah. And it's hard though, isn't it? Because, that kind of perfectionism and then the imposter syndrome, it's all kind of supported by like this societal hustle culture that's telling us if we're absolutely strung out, if we're absolutely exhausted, if we're spending no time relaxing, then we're actually doing a good job. So I think it can be really hard to see that actually this is happening, because a lot of the time, society tells us that when we're wrapped up in imposter syndrome and perfectionism, we're actually doing a great job, and anything less than that is pretty slag.
I agree. And it's funny, like how perfected life is now. And I was watching The Commitments with my husband last night, which is set back in like the 80s. And the level of, how people approach things, what makeup they wear, the clothes they wear, their parenting, it's so, so different. And I was thinking about how perfect everybody tries to be and the pressure that puts on us now. And that it's everywhere in your work, on social media, in your parenting, this idea that you can do things perfectly. Like you say, it's really pervasive, even though when we logically and rationally think about it, that's just not how it's meant to be. And that's not a good way to be either. That takes the fun out of things. It takes kind of spontaneity out of it, and even though we know, the whole kind of highlights reel that is shown to other people, we do that. We forget other people are doing it. And I think that's what feeds into it too, this idea that everybody else has got it together and they're competent and they know what they're doing and, they've got their side hustle or working well in their job. And we forget that we just hear what's going on inside our heads and we only see what they show us. And we forget that what's going on in their heads is really similar to us, and that, we're all kind of like swans. It looks like we're gliding, but actually we're furiously paddling underneath. And yet there's something about modern life that you're not meant to show those bits now. And yet I think those are the most interesting bits of people and what make them more real and relatable, and, what make you kind of fond of somebody as not a perfected person. It's like every part of them.
Yeah, it's much more endearing. Absolutely. And so in the book, you identify some of the common types of imposter syndrome, and perfectionism is one of them. What are some of the other types? Because I think really describing these types, if you're a person who thinks you don't have imposter syndrome and you're the one person who's the imposter, once you hear these types, you're like, oh God, that's me. Because when I hear the perfectionism one, that's what I'm like 100%. But tell me about the different kinds of imposter syndrome as well.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about these types is they were researched by Dr. Valerie Young. So she's done lots of research on it, and she discovered that actually we don't all experience imposter syndrome in the same way. And it's based on how we experience failure-related shame. So it's kind of linked back to those expectations we have of ourselves. And like you say, there's 5 different types, one of which is perfectionism. And the bit I like in Valerie Young's description is, perfectionists think there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, and that other people get it wrong and they know how to get it right. And I think that's very relatable for any perfectionists out there. But the other ones are natural genius. And so for this group, they're probably people who were really good at school and kind of got by and just picked things up without really trying. And then when you get into real life and you're surrounded by other really kind of bright and capable people, and suddenly you've got challenges that you can't just do first time, actually for them, it brings up this sense of shame. and a sense that, oh, I'm no good at this, rather than recognizing that actually, doing anything is difficult and hard at first, and it takes practice or time to get better at it. But they almost don't give themselves that time. And so when they find it hard, even if it's first try, they have the sense that they're an imposter. The third type is the soloist. And so for this group, they really believe that actually success only counts if they have done it on their own, unassisted. So say a project manager who runs a team and is a soloist can't ever really feel the success of the team, because he's like, or she's like, no, it's down to the team. I've just got this really good team working for me. And the other thing for that group is it makes it really difficult for them to ask for help. So the idea of saying, I don't know this, or I haven't got all the information, again, that feels like a failure. So they get this sense that they're going to get found out, rather than recognizing that, of course, you don't know it all. No one knows it all, and asking for help is a sensible approach. The next one is the expert. And for them, they're the type of person who, rather than just, actually, I'm thinking of myself here. When I was younger, I really wanted to try out golf, but rather than go and play a round of golf, my dad used to play. So I was like, I want to have a go. I got lessons first. And that, rather than just go and give things a go. And the same with my training. And I've ended up with like 5 different qualifications, because rather than just be interested in the subject, I want to know all about the subject. And the expert feels like they've got to know everything before they begin. And what I've noticed doing talks and things is it's particularly prevalent for things like consultants or lawyers, where they're kind of going into a client and they feel like they're the expert and they should have all the information, rather than thinking, do I know enough to work it out? And again, it's the kind of person who will go for a job once they know they've got every single thing on the list they're meant to have, rather than how some people will look at me like, yeah, I've got about half of that, I could do this. And the last type is the superwoman or superman. And they're like the perfectionist on turbocharge. So they want to be the best at work, the best athlete, the best kind of host, the best, volunteer. Anything they're doing, they hold it to this high standard of how they should be doing it. And for this group particularly, they're more likely to burn out, because they find downtime, like we touched on earlier, really difficult and uncomfortable, and they feel like they should always be productive. And if they're not being productive, then they're not really worthwhile. And their productivity and achievement is linked really closely to self-esteem. And I think that's the thing for all of these different types, that actually your sense of self with imposter syndrome is often quite linked to the thing you're doing. And so when that's not going well, you don't feel good, whereas actually it misses out all the other parts of who you are.
Yeah, and investing time in those things, because this is like a primarily, we feel this in our careers, or maybe that primarily that's where it's been researched, but investing time in those things. We had a great guest on a couple of weeks ago, Simone Stoltzoff. He's written a book called The Good Enough Job, and it's kind of about diversifying your identity. Highly recommend it if this is resonating with you. If you're listening, I'll put a link in the show notes. But he talks about diversifying our identity into other areas of our life that aren't work, to kind of make us more resilient and more robust when it comes to our careers, and, as you say, more productive. It's interesting how many links there are here to that.
Yeah, I love that idea, and it's something I definitely think about in my work too. And I think of them almost like floats. You want to have lots of different floats, so if one goes down, you've still got the other ones, and you want to see yourself in lots of different ways. And actually, sometimes when I think about, for people who are really focused on work, and work's kind of become the most kind of all-encompassing part of their life, it's like, well, hold on a second, why did you start out on wanting work to go so well? And often people say to me, so I can have a good life. It's like, oh, that is the one thing you're not doing right now, and this idea that, oh, when I get to this point, or once I know I'm doing better, or this kind of it puts life off, and it means that you kind of struggle through these periods without actually thinking about what you can do right now. And really, that's the only time you can do anything right now. You can't know for sure how things are going to be down the line. And often when people get that promotion, or, kind of reach that kind of landmark point they thought was going to put things together, it doesn't really make much difference. And so then having lots of different things in your life that are important to you, and prioritizing those things at all times, that's kind of the key, rather than waiting for this perfect time.
I feel like I need to clip that and play it back to myself every day. Yeah, it's so true. I'm definitely that person. And I think it's especially hard when you have your own thing and you know, like with the podcast, I love it so much. It's like, you know, the thing that I think about 90% of the time, it's so easy to get wrapped up in that and tie your entire identity to it. So your book is incredibly helpful because not only does it help us to identify this within ourselves when so many of us are wandering around not knowing that we're actually not the imposter, but how can we start to overcome it? What are some of the practical ways that are really going to help us work through this?
I think one of the big things is understanding how it operates. So when you go back to this idea that, you know, that discomfort we get is something we all experience, even just knowing that makes a difference, because then you've got a different kind of conversation in your head when you experience it, and starting to really externalize that voice that says you're not good enough, you're going to be found out, your boss isn't happy with you, your friends think you're not a good friend, you know, whatever it's saying, starting to think, hold on a second, actually that voice doesn't have my best interests in mind. And even though it feels like it's keeping me safe and I have to do everything it says, kind of like a bully, you know, you're paying it off, but it never goes away. Much better to try and stand up to it and just start to challenge some of those beliefs. And I think the big part of challenging those beliefs too is that you have to almost start to collect evidence that shows you a different view. And when we go back to that idea of those two rules, you know, I call it the myth of lucky and other stories. And again, like before I wrote the book, it was definitely a trap I fell into too. So I'd written a series of books and I was, you know, really proud of them. But I kind of thought to myself, you know, I just worked really hard. Anybody could have done it. And actually, it wasn't until I wrote The Imposter Cure that I realized, yeah, I did work really hard, but actually that's a skill. And not everybody works really hard. And the fact that I managed to, and, you know, the books came as a result of it, that's something I should be proud of. And so it's just starting to unpick the excuses you've got and look at the reality of actually what's going on. So like that project manager always saying it's the team. It's like, well, hold on, who put the team together and who instructed the team and who's the person people come to? And, you know, the most common one I hear is, I was so lucky. It was so lucky. And just really getting people to stop and be like, was it luck or is it because you've really worked hard and you've put in hours of your time and thought and effort? And even with one like, you know, oh, they really like me. Again, being likable and getting on well in a team is a real skill. And so just starting to tease apart those excuses and starting to see the kind of true picture of what's going on. And I guess the other part of it too is really beginning to build a more compassionate voice. And so often people feel like, you know, self-criticism is what's going to get them where they need to go, or, you know, like this perfectionist approach or the imposter syndrome is good. Actually, it's stopping and saying, is feeling anxious every day a good thing? You know, is feeling bad about yourself a good thing? When you are stuck in those moments and it all becomes overwhelming, that's what leads to paralysis or procrastination. What we need is a much more compassionate voice in our minds that is fair and still wants us to improve and do better on the things that we're struggling with, but in the way we talk to a friend or somebody that we loved, rather than in this really punitive and self-critical way. And that also means, like we said at the start, beginning to notice, okay, I felt like this before, but actually it went well, and updating that information. So the next time you're in that situation and the feelings come up, you remind yourself, okay, last time it was like that, but actually it went well. I was really pleased with it. Yeah, it was hard, but it was worth it. And so you're starting to build information that supports you rather than always picking out the information that is kind of the one bit you did wrong.
Yeah, I always feel like this, you know, we all have those points in our lives where we have to like rewrite our CV and stuff. And I always feel like when I've rewritten my CV or my resume, I'm like, gosh, darn it, I have been so mean to myself. And actually, I have done some pretty cool stuff. And those were great things that I did. And I should back myself more. But I guess like keeping that running document is so helpful. One of the things I've done for the podcast is like start compiling like a monthly summary of like the achievements and where it's hit and like beautiful feedback from people. And like you say, you know, in those moments of self-doubt, like thinking, thinking, oh, I should just go and get a real job. Actually pulling that document out and going, no, this is, I am helping people. People are enjoying the content, and it is offering, something that's not, shaming people, make them feel bad, and is genuinely helpful. That has been a game changer for me. It's so true. It's incredibly helpful.
That. Yeah. And that's definitely something that I recommend too. Doing a CV and looking back at all your experience, not just work, but, kind of all the work stuff, but things you've done in your personal life, friendships, things you've overcome, and really putting it together. In my clinic, I'd get people to start it with me in the session and then go away and write it through the week. And it's amazing once you start to open that door, what you start to see, because you're suddenly attending to the information differently. And like you say, you build this wonderful CV, and I get people to read it back to me in the session. And once they've got over the slight cringe factor of, actually being proud of how they're doing, it's a really amazing thing to do. And the other thing I get people to think is, imagine when you were 16 or 18, if you heard about this person who'd done all these things and had this list of achievements, what would you think of them? Because I think so often we move the goalposts, and where before, we wanted to get to this point, suddenly it's moved forward, and we haven't actually taken on board what it's taken to get to that point. And so when the goalposts move, you don't have that moment like you have when you write it all down and properly take it on board. And like you say, then continuing it. So another thing I get people to do is just write down 3 good things each day. And it could be anything. It could be something nice that happened. It could be an achievement. But it's just about changing the way we attend to information, because we're so quick to see the negative because of how we've evolved with our threat focus. And so it's just almost like retuning into all the good stuff going on. And again, when I get people to read it back, as they go through it, they're often like, oh, I forgot about that. Or because it's amazing how quickly we forget those things. They're like, oh yeah, I did that last week. And it's such a nice way to kind of capture more of that. And in a way, I think about it as like, if you were looking at a picture and you looked at, say, 5% of the picture or 10%, you wouldn't really have any idea of what it was. And that's what we do when we just look at the negative stuff, or the things we're unhappy with, or the things that are not going well. Whereas when you take in the full picture of your life, it's paying attention to every part of it. So you get a truer picture, a bit like if you looked at the whole of a picture, you'd see exactly what it was. And so I think about it in that way, and all the different ways you can do it, like you described, looking back at stuff. Lots of people I work with have a kind of email folder filled with nice feedback that is kind of at this place they can go and look. And so it's really being imaginative and working out the best way for you to remember those things. But I love what you do too. I think that's such a good way to do it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I love the picture analogy. That's brilliant, because just sometimes we are so damn cruel to ourselves, aren't we? And I kind of had a day like that yesterday where I was thinking, it's not, you're not doing that well, and you're not doing this, and this hasn't gone right. And actually you could be dealing with it better, and just taking a minute to go, actually, because one of the other things that I took from you, Jessamy, is that our thoughts are not us, and they're not true. Like, we can have those thoughts, right? And they are apropos of nothing and have an impact on nothing. Is that also a really important thing for us to realize?
Really important. And I think that when I was first training, that's what really was like, a kind of wow moment for me too, this idea that thoughts aren't facts. And that not only that, our mood heavily influences and colors how we feel. So if you wake up and you're feeling a bit anxious, then you're much more likely to have anxious thoughts. And so it's having that moment, a bit like externalizing those imposter thoughts, where when you're having a bad day and you're running through all the things that are wrong, you just stop and think, hold on a second, actually, is that fact, or is that how I'm feeling? And what else is actually going on here? And if I was stepping back from this, how else could I look at it? Or if somebody came to me and said, this is going on, what might I say? And it can be both challenging the evidence in a really kind of practical way and thinking, well, actually, I don't know, someone said something to you and maybe you kind of interpreted it as them being upset with you. Could anything be going on with them? Is there anything else that was happening? Have I been extra sensitive today because I'm not feeling so good? And so challenging it in that way. But I think it's also seeing those days where everything feels wrong as a bit of a warning sign to your mood that day, and thinking, okay,
Yes.
I know when I've got a really stressful week, I can suddenly find myself thinking, oh, I've got too many things booked in. I'm not managing this properly. I should have a different approach. I need to rethink what I'm doing. And then when I just stop that kind of thought and just pause, I think, hold on, actually, I'm just not feeling good today. I don't need to reorder my life. I don't need to change everything. I just need to think today's a hard day. That's okay, and maybe I can't even feel better today because I just need to get through it. But by tomorrow, I'm going to feel better. Or maybe I can think about the things that will make me feel better today in that moment. But I guess it's like you say, it's not believing the whole story. It's seeing it as a warning sign or seeing it as information that's important about how we're feeling. But it's knowing that the story our mind creates isn't always the truth.
Yeah, and I think that is just an absolute game changer if we can recognize that and slow down our thoughts too, because I think when now the way we operate, we take in so much information, then we start to feel anxious. It's so easy to quickly spiral. Whereas if we could kind of acknowledge those thoughts and think, you know what, this doesn't actually sound like me today. Something else is at play. I'm going to wait until tomorrow and reassess. That can be a massive, massive, massive game changer for me. And
Definitely.
yeah, it's really helpful. And so one of the things that I guess an imposter syndrome sufferer would say is, but if I start talking kindly to myself and bigging myself up and, really getting behind myself and backing myself, I'm not going to be producing as much. I'm not going to be as productive or as successful because like that cruel voice really drives me. And B, I'm going to have a massive ego and no one's going to like me. Why is that not true?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That is what people think. And really, that's what makes it so hard to change. And I think it's not underestimating how difficult it is to make these changes. It's such an active approach, and it's really making a decision that you want things to be different and that you want to try out another way of doing things. And when it comes to that idea that, you're going to slack off and do absolutely nothing, well, for one, the research shows that when you have this more compassionate approach, outcomes are far better, and that actually self-criticism leads to much worse outcomes. And I think the other part of it is also seeing, you've done it this way for a long time. It isn't working for you. Isn't it worth just trying a different way and seeing what happens? And it sounds a bit strange, but I think about it as a racehorse. If you had a racehorse, you wouldn't race the horse every day to get the best results out of it. You'd give it time at grass or kind of, to chill out or whatever it might be. And you'd think about the food they were eating and the sleep they were getting. And you'd want that all to filter into them being the best horse they can be. And I think that's the other part of it. You're not conscientious and high achieving because of the imposter syndrome. You're that person anyway. And actually the imposter syndrome is getting in the way of that. Wouldn't it be better not to feel anxious every day, not to fear being found out, not to be kind of living in this way that's constant pressure and kind of takes away all the joy and pleasure in any successes you've got? And so it's really letting go of that and seeing imposter syndrome and perfectionism as what holds you back rather than pushes you forward. You're the person who's doing well. You're the person who has made these kind of achievements or successes in your life, and just starting to trust in that and trusting in what you need as a person to continue with that in the longer term and not burn out and be able to enjoy what you're doing and have space for your life outside of it. And I think the other part which you mentioned is also really common and a particularly British thing, but it's anywhere, isn't it? This idea of, and actually I think culturally it can be a thing that if you talk too much about yourself, things will go wrong, in lots of cultures. But again, I'm not suggesting that you go around and shout from the rooftops how amazing you are or tell everybody you meet how brilliant you're doing. I'm just suggesting that you start to take on board these things for yourself so that they become things you really know about yourself, and that's actually really important information for doing well in your life or for living well, knowing what you're capable of and how you're doing and all the previous experience that feeds into that. And again, another way I think about it, I have all these kind of funny ways of thinking about things, but is like with the tennis and how they do the seeding, or say like the football with the league. you're not based on your last match. It's the accumulation of all of your matches that make you who you are. And when you know that about yourself, it means there's room to make mistakes. There's room for failure, which are totally normal. But also you have a sense of how you're going to do when you're faced with a challenge that is backed by previous experience rather than a fear-based response.
Oh, this is good. See, I thought I was making this episode for Jess, and now I feel like I'm making it for me. I really needed this. And I'm sure so many people who are listening are thinking, yep, I'm there with you, Ed. I feel seen. The good news is these are really simple solutions that we can absolutely back ourselves with. And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because when you break it down like that, it's just really basic. It's like pay attention to the facts, not the silly voice in your head.
Yeah. And I think that's what's so great about it, that actually it is common sense. That's what's so nice about it. When you think about it, you're like, yeah, that is right. Actually, this is within my control too. This is something that I can make a difference with. And also, if I heard that somebody else talking about it, I'd be like, yeah, fair enough. Why can't I apply that to myself? Have the same rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but should we be sharing and voicing these thoughts that we're having with other people? Will that kind of help us to work through this, both ourselves personally and collectively as a society?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always about choosing the right people to share it with. So people that you're close to and who you trust in. And I think that applies both within our personal lives, but also at work. If you've got a boss who's more open about, I remember somebody saying to me, they'd gone to this meeting and afterwards their boss had said to them, oh, do you think it went all right? And they suddenly had this moment where they realized my boss gets nervous too. And at that meeting that I'm turning up and feeling a bit stressed about, they're also feeling stressed about. And so I think when you're a bit more transparent at work, then it makes a massive difference in terms of understanding this is how these things go, rather than this is a problem with me. And again, in your friendships and in your personal life and in your relationships, it's so important to show all of yourself, because you get a chance for other people to open up and echo those stories. But also you don't feel like you've got to be a certain way to be accepted or to fit in. And like we already said, it's our insecurities and our vulnerabilities and the things that we muck up on that actually you connect most with other people over. As much as I, love hearing about my friends' successes, which are also really important to talk about. And I think, again, it's something perhaps people don't do enough. I also want to hear the stories of the things that have been difficult and the things that have gone wrong, because that's what I can really identify with and relate to. And so when you share that, you start to get a different picture of how things are, and you're not just seeing that kind of swan gliding, you're remembering they're paddling furiously underwater too.
Yeah, absolutely. I do find it incredibly endearing. And when you start to share, other people start to share more. I've been working there's like a couple of people that I've worked with in the past who have this facade of everything's amazing and it's all brilliant and aren't we having a fabulous time and it's all so funny and lovely. And you just think, I don't really know who you are. And it doesn't make me like you anymore. And I'm sure you're a lovely person, but I can't really get a grip on you or understand who you are as a person. And I think it's so much more endearing when people share their truth and say, you know what, I found this hard. And I also think, a lot of the time I like to share things that I'm finding difficult, not because I want to offload on people, but because I want to say, like, everyone's going through it, if everyone's having a shit time. And I think that makes people feel a lot better, right?
Yeah. And I think that the stories, it's, I think about it as the stories we share, that kind of makes up how we see ourselves and how we think about ourselves and how we think about other people. And when you share those more personal parts of your story, both good and bad, actually that gives you a much kind of richer framework to kind of connect to others and to start to understand yourself. And in a way, when you don't say the difficult bits and you're showing this kind of perfect picture, probably there's not much room to say the good bits either, but also for people to really be behind you on those good bits because they know what it's taken to get there. And when you're more open, as much as that can leave you feeling vulnerable, actually that's the best solution to vulnerability, because it lets you see again that you're human, and that when you open up and say about the awful morning you had, your friend can open up and say exactly the same probably. And if they can't, they know about what that's like from another time, you know? And that's when you get to really see it and really believe it. It's all very well knowing the theory, but until you sort of live that and change things and see the evidence, it's much harder to update your view.
Yeah, absolutely. So you obviously have spent a long time researching this. You've written the book. It's what you do. It's your job. Is it something that you still struggle with?
I think writing the book made a huge difference. And I would definitely put myself in the category of, I didn't realize quite how much I had it. So for me, one of the things I found hardest was going and doing talks and, you know, going and standing up in front of people, and even writing the book. I'd say to people, you know, I'm not a real author, because I thought of myself as a clinical psychologist who happened to have written a few books. And I think, again, with things like perfectionism, I kind of thought, well, I don't do anything perfectly, so I'm not a perfectionist. And then suddenly when I thought about how it can narrow your focus, or the expectations you set yourself, or what you take on board, or those moving goalposts, I was like, oh, tick, tick, tick. You know, suddenly you're seeing it. So it was a really interesting book, both personally and professionally. But it has made a difference. I don't feel imposter syndrome now. You know, when I go and do those things, which I still get really nervous about, I don't think I'm an imposter, I shouldn't be doing this. I think, well, of course I'm going to feel like this. This is out of my comfort zone, and I'm not so confident doing these things. And when I kind of have that moment of, why do they think I know what I'm talking about? I kind of think, well, because I've been doing this for like 15 years and I've got 5 different degrees. And, you know, I just remind myself of those things. So it's not that you never get the thoughts. It's just that you just have a different answer to them. And knowing like what's your comfort zone and what's not, and what's going to come up and how that's going to feel. And it doesn't take away from the stress I might feel before, say, a really big event that I want to go really well. But it just changes what I think of myself in the run up in terms of my ability to do it, and knowing it feels hard because this is a big deal and I care about it, rather than because I'm an imposter and I'm going to be found out.
Oh gosh, I love this. This is fabulous. I feel like I've had the same experience that, probably not as a profound one, but same experience that you had writing the book in this interview, thinking, oh God, I thought I was making this for Jess, but it's definitely about me. And so is there anything else that's really important to remember when it comes to dealing with imposter syndrome, or one thing that you absolutely want people to remember when they're thinking about this?
I think it's hard to distill it down to one thing almost, because the thing that I discovered when I researched the book and wrote it is how much fits under the imposter syndrome umbrella. So it is perfectionism, or fear of failure, or insecurity, or self-doubt. It is your relationships and how you're doing. You know, it's this broad, the umbrella is imposter syndrome, and there's this broad kind of human experience that lies underneath it. And I suppose it's just, maybe that's the final thought. It's just remembering what it means to be human, that it's not that perfected highlights reel, that's not what we should be reaching for or hoping for. And actually, you know, I've worked with some really outwardly successful people who have hit all those things that we might hope to achieve, and it hasn't changed how they feel. So it's knowing it's not a thing or a place you get to that makes you happy. It's knowing that thing we talked about today. It's how you kind of live every day, and appreciating what you've got, and slowing down and backing yourself, and having space for your relationships and being real in those relationships. Those are the things that really matter. And those are the things that give you more confidence in yourself, but also allow you to enjoy your life more. And I guess it's remembering that, because that makes a huge difference when you're having a difficult day.
And isn't that so liberating? You know, we don't have to strive for that next, promotion, or that next pay rise, or that next accolade, because, you know, obviously that's one part of our life. But as you say, we need lots of different rafts. We can really invest in those other areas of our lives and not feel guilty about that, because those are what is going to bring us true joy and contentment, rather than chasing the next thing.
Exactly. And that then, you can still be high achieving and you can still want to reach your goals, but you're in it while you're doing it rather than waiting for that point. So you can still aim high and want to do well. It's just how you do it that changes and the experience of it that changes. And then you get so much more out of life.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've been trying to focus on this year is the joy of doing rather than trying to get to that accolade. Because I think so many people found they get the accolade. Yeah, it feels great for like 10 minutes. And then you're like, okay, what's next?
Yeah. And that's
it's
what
so
I think
true.
about, that it's not a race, it's an adventure. And when you think about it, what you do each day has the biggest impact rather than these kind of great big things that are in the distance. And so it's changing that mindset to how you live each day and how you treat yourself and how you think about yourself and, looking outside yourself at other people and what's going on for them too. That's what living really is rather than, this perfect ideal.
Oh gosh, this has been good. I needed this check-in. Thank you so much, Jessamy. That's been an absolute joy to chat.
Thank you for having me. I've loved speaking to you.
Oh, so great. I know you guys will have loved that as much as me. And hopefully you've been listening to it too and going, oh my gosh, yep, I've definitely either got much worse imposter syndrome than I thought, or I definitely have imposter syndrome and I didn't think I did. And hopefully we've given you some great solutions there. Dr. Jessamy Hibberd is a clinical psychologist and her book is The Imposter Cure, How to Stop Feeling Like a Fraud and Escape the Mind Trap of Imposter Syndrome. If this has really hit with you, and I'm sure it has, you're going to find the link to the book in the show notes and where you can check out more of Dr. Jessamy's work too, because it's all so bloody helpful. You're going to love it. Thank you so much for joining me. It is such a joy to join you every week. I really, really enjoy it because, as you heard, I learn as much as you guys do. So I'm absolutely loving this. I'm really grateful to you for joining me. I'm Ed Stott. I sincerely hope that's helpful.